Tonight we're going to look at part 2, and there's several parts to this because like I've said before, there's no way you could do one evening of all of this because there's so much to it. So we're doing it in several parts. This is part 2, and the main thought on this particular subject tonight about the Sabbath is no 10 commandments from Adam to Moses. You see, people will say, well, there's no Sabbath. There was no 10 commandments from Adam to Moses. And so that's what we're going to be looking at for the next few parts. But we want to welcome everyone. This has been a response to Dale Ratziff and Facing the Critics. We've been looking at some of the things that the critics say. And so we're going to look at more of it tonight. And we're going to start with Moses. We're going to look at Moses, and we're going to look at a text that sometimes the critics bring up in regard to no 10 commandments before Moses, previous to Moses. But tonight's meeting is not going to be on just this text. I have a video in the future just on these texts that we're going to be talking about. But this is just a brief preview of what we're looking at with Moses. And here's a text people often use, found in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And you can read the whole chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 5. And people bring this text up a lot in regard to no 10 commandments previous to Moses. And I want to look at it because notice what the Bible says in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And again, I have a whole video coming up in the future just on Deuteronomy chapter 5. Okay? And that'll be in the future because I'm going to look at it carefully. But we're going to talk about this some tonight. But notice what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And you know, it's good to have your Bibles. Even though we're going on the screen, it's good to have your Bibles right there in your hands to be able to go to the Bible and read it for yourself, study it for yourself, and that's what we're going to look at tonight. Deuteronomy chapter 5, notice what it says in Deuteronomy 5. And Moses called who? All Israel, and said unto them, Hear, O Israel. Now that's very important because God is talking to Moses, and He's talking to who? Israel. Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that ye may learn them and keep them and do them. So God is talking to Moses, and it's very important because He's saying, Hear, O Israel. Now it's interesting, the Hebrew term here for Israel doesn't only describe something that you hear audibly, but obey what you hear. See, that's very important and relevant to understand that it's not only enough to hear something, but you're to obey what you hear. And of course, God is speaking to Israel. We don't deny that. God is talking to Israel. Hear, O Israel. But now I want to ask some questions. Very important questions relevant for this very text. Here's a question. Did any of these statutes and judgments exist before Moses? That's a very important question. There's no trap question. It's not a trick question. It's a very honest question. Did any of these statutes and judgments exist before Moses? You see, because the objection is, the 10 commandments didn't exist before Moses. Okay? So we're going to ask that question. We're going to ask another question. In other words, is there anything in these statutes and judgments previous to Moses? In other words, is there something in these statutes that existed before Moses? That's the question. Did all of these statutes and judgments come into existence for the first time with Moses? That's the question we need to ask. Did any of these statutes and judgments exist for Adam? Now that's a very important question. You see, because our whole thing we're talking about is dealing with the objection that the 10 commandments didn't exist before Moses. And so we're going all the way back to Adam, not just to Abraham. We're going all the way back to Adam and ask, did any of these statutes that God gave to Israel, to Moses and Israel, and judgments exist for Adam? In other words, is there anything in these statutes and judgments that was given to Moses that existed before, that is, previous to Moses, that was given to Adam? That's what we're looking at. That's what we're looking at. Now, some may think this is repetition, and yes, I am repeating some of these things and adding to it and rewording it so you get the point very clearly. Was there anything in these same statutes and judgments that was given to Adam to learn, keep, and do them the same as Israel? Very important question. Is there anything in these statutes and judgments that was given to Israel for Christians in the new covenant today, you and me? See, because that's the point we're looking at. You see, if you take Moses from Moses to the cross, and we find in these statutes and judgments that Moses had something that existed for Adam pre-Moses, and something that existed after the cross, after Moses, then we could see there's more to this than just what people are looking at. Much more. Dale Ratzlaff says this. He says, on the other hand, and you could read the context of his statement, and it's amazing what he says. On the other hand, what Israel was commanded to do on the Sabbath would have been done naturally by Adam. So now he's connecting Adam to something Israel did. That's exactly what he's doing. He's connecting something to Adam that Israel did about the Sabbath. Now that's very interesting, this statement. Let's look at it carefully. Let's go deeper than just the surface. Let's go deeper into his statement. Notice what he says. On the other hand, what Israel was commanded to do on the Sabbath would have been done naturally to Adam, by Adam and Eve. Therefore, no command would have been needed. You see, because God commanded Moses and Israel to keep the Sabbath. He commanded that. Okay? Now, if Adam was doing naturally that, there would be no need of a command. That's what Dale Ratzlaff is saying. But it's interesting because how many times do you hear people, and by the way, we're going to do a whole meeting, maybe even two, on Colossians chapter 2, where Paul's talking about let no man judge you in meat or in drink in respect of a holy day and of the Sabbath days and new moons and all those things, the moons and all those things, holy days. And it's interesting because people will look at that and they'll say, well, look, we don't have to keep the Sabbath because what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2. And they'll say, that was a shadow pointing towards Jesus. But if you look at Dale Ratzlaff's statement here carefully, he's going back to Adam. He's going backwards, not forwards to Christ. Do you understand what I'm saying? Look at what he's saying. Let's read it one more time. On the other hand, what Israel was commanded to do on the Sabbath would have been done naturally by Adam. That's back to Adam in creation. Now, another thing to consider is not only is it going back to creation with Adam, rather than forward as a shadow to Christ, but going backwards to Adam, he says naturally. Well, conclude it by understanding he's talking about the Sabbath. Why didn't he put the word Sabbath there as well? Not just with Israel. In other words, to get the big picture and comparing back to Adam, what Adam naturally did, here's the way you really should have phrased it. On the other hand, what Israel was commanded to do on the Sabbath would have been done naturally on the Sabbath by Adam and Eve. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, the Sabbath would be in the second part of his statement just as well it was in the first part of his statement with Israel. If that's exactly what Adam did, by Adam and Eve, naturally. So no command would have been needed. So here's a question. Where did Adam and Eve get the idea to have done naturally what Israel was commanded to do on the Sabbath? Now, is that an important question or not? Where did Adam and Eve get that idea? In other words, they didn't concoct that idea themselves. Just like God blessed the seventh day and sanctified the seventh day. Adam and Eve did not concoct that idea. God did that. So my question is, if Adam did naturally what Israel was to do on the Sabbath, as a commandment, he did naturally, where did he naturally get the idea to do that? He was created in God's image. That's where it came from. Where did Adam and Eve get the idea to behave the way they behaved on that first seventh day? Listen to what Dale Ratziff says. It appears, now this is an amazing statement. Look at him carefully. Go below the surface. You're studying this, not just reading it. It appears, now this is what Dale Ratziff says, it appears that the Sabbath laws given to the Israelites were designed to cause them to behave very much as Adam and Eve behaved in Eden. Now in Eden it was before the fall. Remember, they were removed from the Garden of Eden. So this would have been in their perfect state in the Garden of Eden before the fall. To cause them to behave very much as Adam and Eve behaved in Eden. Now think it through. If God created, which He did, not if, He did create Adam and Eve in His image, and they were perfect before the fall, yes? Then why wouldn't we want the same thing? If that's what the Sabbath was designed to do, Sabbath laws, was to bring them to behave more like Adam and Eve, why wouldn't we want to do that too? Yes? While this fact, now watch what he says. Now he calls it a fact. But notice what he says. While this fact is not clearly brought out in the scriptural record, he's calling it a fact, it is strongly implied in the wording of what? The fourth commandment. Isn't that interesting? So if this is implied in the wording in the fourth commandment, and the Sabbath was given to Israel to help them behave more like Adam and Eve in a perfect state in Eden before the fall, why wouldn't we want that? Why wouldn't we want that? Yes? So if what Dale Ratziff says is true, the Sabbath laws given to the Israelites were designed to cause them to behave very much as Adam and Eve in Eden behaved in Eden, and is strongly implied in the wording in the fourth commandment, how then is the Sabbath ceremonial ritual law if indeed it caused them to behave like Adam and Eve in Eden? You see, because the critics don't want to say that the Sabbath is moral. They want to say the Sabbath is ritual law. It's ceremonial law. And yet if it goes back to creation to help us behave more like Adam and Eve before the fall, why then wouldn't we want that? Now, he says it's implied in the fourth commandment. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them is, and rested the seventh day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So if the Sabbath was that which Adam naturally did, and no command would have been needed, and yet these here was to help Israel be like Adam and Eve in Eden before the fall, I would want that. I would want that. Wouldn't you want that? That sounds to me like a good thing. Not a bad thing. You see, Adam and Eve was in a perfect state before the fall. That's a good thing. Dale said the Sabbaths of the Old Covenant appeared to be mini rest stops. They were like a pretend game where Israel behaved like Adam and Eve on that first seventh day. Wow. Again, my response would be, hey, if this helps you behave like Adam before the fall on that first seventh day, why wouldn't we want to keep that which God blessed and sanctified on the seventh day in creation, which Dale Ratziff is going back to Adam? That's backwards. And yet they want to say the Sabbath was ceremonial, pointing towards Christ in Colossians chapter 2. If what Dale Ratziff says is true, the Sabbaths were like a pretend game where Israel behaved like Adam and Eve on that first seventh day. Again, how then could the Sabbath be ceremonial, ritual law, if indeed it caused them to behave like Adam and Eve in Eden before the fall on that first seventh day? Before the fall. Let that soak in. Why does Dale Ratziff have the Sabbath pointing back to behave very much as Adam and Eve behaved in Eden on that first seventh day, rather than a shadow, ritual, ceremonial law pointing forward to Christ, as they say in Colossians chapter 2? I wish they would make up their mind. Would our critics admit that what God did in creation before the fall was blessed and sanctified the seventh day was a moral action rather than a ceremonial or ritual? If what Dale Ratzer says is true, why wouldn't the Sabbath be just as much for us today as it was for Israel, if indeed it was designed to cause them to behave very much as Adam and Eve behaved in Eden, and is strongly implied in the wording in the fourth commandment? Did Adam and Eve before the fall have Jesus? After all, was not Adam and Eve created in the image of Jesus? If so, what exactly existed in these statutes and judgments previous to Moses? And for Christians today in the new covenant, you and me? If not, see, what did I say? If so. If not, then nothing should be found in these statutes and judgments previous to Moses, correct? You can't have it both ways. Once you start looking at these statutes and judgments, you're going to find there's things in them that did exist before Moses and do exist today after the cross. The Bible shows us those things. And if not, see, I'm looking at it both ways. If so, if not. If so, if not. You go back, and what you don't get tonight, go back and watch the videos. And when you get into these questions, think these questions through carefully. See, that's the problem with the critics. They don't want to deal with these questions. They don't want to deal with these questions. And if not, then nothing should be found in these statutes and judgments given only to the Jews. You hear that all the time. See, I don't deny the fact that the Ten Commandments and the judgments and the statutes was given to Israel. I don't deny that fact. What I deny is that it's only for the Jews. And we're going to see some interesting things in this. So, and if not, then nothing should be found in these statutes and judgments given only to the Jews, Israel only, that would be given for Christians today in the new covenant, you and me, correct? So it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't. Did Adam have statutes and judgments given to him previous to Moses? If yes, what statutes and judgments was given to Adam? If not, what about Bible texts that do show statutes and judgments was given to Adam? And would there be anything in these statutes and judgments that was given to Israel only that the critics say have been given after Moses to Christians in the new covenant, you and me? So here's the point. Adam and all the patriarchs, did they have statutes and judgments? Now I'm talking before Moses. Old covenant statutes and judgments. This is what people say was given to Israel only. So that would mean then that there shouldn't be anything in the Ten Commandments. There shouldn't be anything in the statutes. There shouldn't be anything in the judgments previous to Moses. Fair? If this were true right here. Old covenant, statutes and judgments, Jews, Israel only. Ten Commandments. New covenant. Are there statutes and judgments in the new covenant for all mankind? Well, you know, even Dale Ratzer says 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the new covenant. So there's 9 commandments. You notice I got question marks with each one of these because we're going to look at it carefully. So why is there question marks at each one of these? Why? Well, of course, in Moses' day, in these statutes and judgments, you had what? Burnt offerings. Oh, but we find burnt offerings previous to Moses. Right underneath, looky there. Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. Job chapter 1, verse 5. 42, Job 42, 8. Sacrifice, Genesis 31, 54. What do we find with Cain and Abel? Where did these judgments and statutes come from? If they only existed with Moses, then they shouldn't even be from Adam to Moses. What about offerings? Genesis chapter 4, we read it in verses 3 through 5. So already we got a problem with the idea that these statutes and judgments were given only to Israel. That'd be a contradiction of these scriptures right here, in reference to the very same thing in these statutes and judgments that was given to Israel. For example, listen to this. New Testament. You know, I hear all the time, I hear the critics say, oh, but that's the Old Testament. Let's go to the New Testament. Well, see, I don't see a false dichotomy and a false teaching between the Old Testament and New Testament. I don't see that at all. Matter of fact, I see the Old Testament and the New Testament as a whole Bible. Right? A whole Bible. Friends, you can't understand the New Testament without the Old Testament. It's impossible. It's impossible, especially in the book of Revelation. When Jesus is speaking, notice what Jesus says. Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. So let's ask a question to the critics. When Jesus said this, was Jesus stating something new for the first time? Was he stating something new for the first time? Or was Jesus simply quoting something that has already been mentioned before? Yes? But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer. Now, by the way, the Pharisees were what? Jews. That's his audience. So he's speaking to the Israelites. He's speaking to, Hear, O Israel. That's what he's speaking to. I wonder why the critics don't take the context of this in its proper context. But notice what one of them did. So one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying, all right, now I'm going to ask a question, then we're going to get back to the text. Was Jesus speaking to the Jews when he said this? You tell me. Was Jesus speaking to the Jews when he said this? Yes, he was. Was what Jesus said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, only for the Jews, the children of Israel, the house of Israel only? Would you say that that was just for the Jews, just for the Pharisees and the Sadducees and that lawyer that came to Jesus? Would you say it was just for them? But notice what he goes on to say. So this lawyer says to Jesus, Master, which is the great commandment? Where is it at? Where's it at? In the law. So this commandment's in the law. He says, which is the great commandment in the law? So I'm going to ask a question. Is the Sabbath in the law? Is it yes or no? What about Sunday? Is Sunday in the law? So is Sunday in the law? Now let's read on. Now this is interesting in Mark. Read this whole thing in Mark. See, we just looked at Matthew, and Mark's talking about the same thing. But Mark says some more. That's why it's good to compare on the same subject exactly what this disciple says, exactly what this one says, and exactly what this one says. Because watch what happens. Jesus says, And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart. Now that's what we just read in Matthew, didn't we? And with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. But watch this. That's verse 30. Look at verse 29. 29. Right before verse 30. Look at this. And Jesus answered him, The first of all the commandments is what? Hear, O Israel. There you go. You've got Israel right there. That's what Jesus is saying. Hear, O Israel. The Lord our God is one Lord. Now, I've heard Christians today say they believe this. So is that just for Israel? I've heard Christians say, yes, the Lord our God is one Lord. But where did that come from? It was first given to who? Hear, O Israel. This is the first commandment. Notice what he says. The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel. And then we read verse 30, right after that. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. So there's nothing new about that. And was that given to the Jews? Was that given to Israel? Yes, it was. Right there it is. Hear, O Israel. So the first commandment has to do with Israel, correct? Yes? Does this commandment given to Israel have anything to do with us? Does it? I wish the critics would answer that question. Hear, O Israel. Does this commandment given to Israel have anything to do with us? Notice what Mark goes on to say in verse 33. And to love Him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love his neighbor as himself. Jesus is saying this. And yet, He made it very clear in verse 29, Hear, O Israel. Yes? Now, to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself, wasn't that given to Israel? Are we to do that too? And God says that it is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Friends, burnt offerings and sacrifices didn't start with Moses. They were in the statutes and judgments that go all the way back to Adam and Eve. Did not Adam and Eve sacrifice? Did not Cain and Abel sacrifice? So is loving God and our neighbor that God commanded Israel for us too. You know what the critics fail to realize is that the oracles of God that was given to Israel, Israel's mission was to take that to the world. They were to show who the true God of the heavens and the earth, who created the heavens and the earth, was. They were to take the oracles of God to the world. That was their mission. Luke 10. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? I would say that's an important question. We could ask that question today too, couldn't we? What must I do to inherit eternal life? Now notice what Jesus said. I wish our critics would really grasp this question right here Jesus asked. He said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? If you open the Bible and look and see what's in the law, you don't find Sunday there. You don't find the first day of the week there. Written in the law. And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. That's found in Luke. So a question I have. So is Sunday the first day of the week specific moral laws, God's moral law, God's eternal moral principles for all mankind? Or is Sunday ritual law, ceremonial law? Which is it? Or is it neither? Explain how Sunday is in the new covenant and is neither moral law or ritual law. Somewhere along the line, they gotta figure this out. Somewhere along the line, the critics have to figure all this out. Because you see the words highlighted there. I highlighted the critics' words. These aren't my words, what you see highlighted. I highlighted the critics' words. Okay? And I'm just simply asking a question in regard to this very thing. Are Christians in the New Covenant to keep the 9 commandments of the 10 commandments? Is it true that the critics interpret this not, and I'm going to go into the text, to mean that the 10 commandments could not have been previous to Moses because this covenant was not given to the fathers? Very important question, because we're going to read this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 5, now verse 2, where it says, "The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb." That's verse 2. Okay? Remember, I have a whole video coming up just on these passages. So did this covenant God made with Israel in Horeb include to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself? Was that included in the covenant that God made with Israel? Yes or no? So did this covenant God made with Israel in Horeb include to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, given to us today? Well, but it was given to Israel, wasn't it? So we would have to say that yes, it was given to Israel, but not Israel only. Yes? So did this covenant God made with Israel in Horeb include to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, given to the fathers before Moses? In other words, previous to Moses. Now let's look at it carefully. Here's where they focus on the word not. Notice what it says. Verse 3. "The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day." So they'll say, see, verse 3 tells us God only made it with Israel, and He did not make this covenant with Abraham or Adam or anybody previous to Moses. And they look at this word not. So then, to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself did not, got it, exist from Adam to Moses, but did from Moses to us. Is that what you believe? Very important question. Is to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself a moral issue? Is that moral and moral principles to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself? Is that moral principles? Moral. Is it true that the critics interpret this not in Deuteronomy 5:3 to mean that the 10 Commandments could not have been previous to Moses because this covenant was not given to the fathers? By the way, it's interesting because there's more to this. Other texts clarify what it means, not, and the word not. And they never quote these other texts. That's why I have a whole meeting coming up just on Deuteronomy chapter 5. And we're going to get into another video on verses 12 through 15 in Deuteronomy chapter 5. So, is there anything at all in this covenant that God did give to the fathers previous to Moses? Remember, they're counting on that word not, meaning they didn't exist before Moses. If it is the true meaning that this not means that the 10 Commandments could not have been previous to Moses, then there should be nothing in this covenant that was given to the fathers previous to Moses, correct? Nothing. Are you following me? Do y'all understand what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm saying here? In other words, if the fathers didn't have this, then there shouldn't be nothing in those judgments, in those statutes, in those 10 Commandments that existed before Moses. How is the covenant God made with Moses and Israel different than the fathers previous to Moses? That's what we have to ask. How is it different? Is it possible that this not in the text has a different meaning than the critics say? Could it be possible there's a different meaning for this not than what the critics assume it means? Is it possible that in the Hebrew language, a Hebrew idiom is being used based upon other Bible texts and the meaning is different than the critics have thought? Is that possible? Well, when we get into that whole video on just these texts, you're going to see other texts they never quote. They'll quote Hebrews chapter 8. And we're going to go into that too. When we deal with the Old Covenant, New Covenant, Old Covenant vanishes away, is obsolete. You know, I can't cover all these objections in one meeting. So we got a whole video, just probably a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them, on Old Covenant and New Covenant. Okay? But I want to ask this question again. Is it possible that in the Hebrew language, a Hebrew idiom is being used based upon other Bible texts and the meaning is different than the critics have thought? Well, let's move on to Abraham. Let's go back now to Abraham, which is pre-Moses. Abraham lived before Moses. Because Dale Ratziff says some interesting things about Abraham and the covenants. Listen to what Dale Ratziff says. The covenant God made with Abraham is of great interest to our study, for here are the roots of what will be called the new or everlasting covenant. And that's what he says. Now this is going to get really interesting, so really think this through. And like I said, go back and watch the video and slow down and just study it. Don't just watch a minute or 2 of it and then, no, watch the whole thing and study it. But Dale says the covenant God made with Abraham is of great interest to our study, for here are the roots of what will be called the new or everlasting covenant. By the way, a lot of people don't understand the meaning of new and what the Greek term is to describe the new covenant. They've never really looked at the word new. Now in Genesis chapter 17 verse 7, notice what the Bible says. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. So now here's a promise that God is making with Abraham. In Genesis chapter 17, long before Moses. And he's talking about this everlasting covenant. So is this everlasting covenant for Abraham's seed only? Or does it also include Abraham himself in this everlasting covenant? What did it say in the text? And I will establish my covenant between me and thee. This is between God and Abraham. And thy seed, your seed, Abraham, after thee in their generations. So is Abraham included in this everlasting covenant? Is he? So is this everlasting covenant for Abraham's seed only, or does it also include Abraham himself in this everlasting covenant? Would you say Abraham himself is included in this everlasting covenant? Is the everlasting covenant and the new covenant the same exact covenant? Very important to understand this. I'd like the critics to go through systematically these questions and begin to answer them. Just write them down and start answering these questions. Is the everlasting covenant and the new covenant the same exact covenant? In other words, is the everlasting covenant the new covenant? Is the Abrahamic covenant the everlasting covenant? Is the Abrahamic covenant the new covenant? Dale Ratliff says the new covenant is a continuum of the Abrahamic covenant. A continuum. However, it connects to Abraham before Abraham was circumcised, so it could apply to all nations. Now that's an interesting thing he's saying there. Isn't it amazing that the Sabbath is only for the Jews, and yet according to the Abrahamic covenant, it's for all nations? I'm not talking about the Sabbath. They'd say, no, the Sabbath's not for all nations, but the Abrahamic covenant is for all nations before he was circumcised. So what would that imply? That after he was circumcised, it wasn't for all nations? He says the covenant that was ratified, now watch carefully, the covenant that was ratified by the blood of Christ was then not the Sinaitic covenant, that's what he says is the Ten Commandments, but the Abrahamic covenant or new covenant. So is he equating the Abrahamic covenant with the new covenant? Yes or no? Is he or not? So in other words, is the Abrahamic covenant the new covenant or not the new covenant? Which is it? Is the Abrahamic covenant the same exact covenant as the new covenant? See, I'm basing these questions on their statements, what the critic is saying, what Dale Ratliff is saying. In other words, are they one and the same covenant? Is the everlasting covenant, is the Abrahamic covenant, is the new covenant? That's what I'm asking. That's what I'm asking. So Dale Ratliff says, although it was presented before the old or first covenant, it was ratified after the Sinaitic covenant and therefore is called new. That's what he's saying. I'm only quoting Dale Ratliff on the Abrahamic covenant. The new covenant defines the old covenant as both the Ten Commandments and the other laws which made up the old covenant. So Dale Ratliff says the old covenant was laws written on stone, the Ten Commandments. That's found in his book, Sabbath in Christ, on page 231. What you see there is what Dale Ratliff says. New covenant, laws written on the heart. But he's saying not the Ten Commandments, not the Sabbath. Okay? So, question. Abrahamic covenant, Moses' old covenant, laws written on stone. New covenant, everlasting covenant, laws written on the heart. This is the paradigm. So I got a question there with the Abrahamic covenant. Because he's saying the Abrahamic covenant's the everlasting covenant. And it's the roots of the new covenant. And so that's why I asked the question, is the everlasting covenant and the new covenant one and the same thing? So did the Abrahamic covenant that Christ's blood ratified have the laws written on the heart, as it does in the new covenant? Was there anything in the Abrahamic covenant that was written in the Ten Commandments? Now we're going to get into something very interesting here. Remember, they're saying that these things didn't exist before Moses. That's why I'm asking these questions. Is there any of the Ten Commandments that was in the Abrahamic covenant? Now remember, he's associating the Abrahamic covenant with the everlasting covenant. He's associating the Abrahamic covenant with the new covenant. That's what he's doing. Listen to what Dale says. These verses state unequivocally that the covenant between God and Israel, which is made at Sinai, was the Ten Commandments. It is clear that Abraham's obedience was an obedience of faith to specific commands of God given to him and not to any Ten Commandment law. So he's saying no, Ten Commandments had nothing to do with Abraham. Nothing there. It's interesting that sometime back, Doug Batchelor got into a discussion, an actual debate. I don't know if any people watched that. But Doug Batchelor got into a debate with Steve Gregg. Now, Steve Gregg is very popular, and he deals with some of these very important issues and the controversies over these issues. And So Doug Batchelor debated Steve Gregg. Well, of course, Steve is anti-Sabbath, and Doug Batchelor is for the Sabbath. You see? That's what this debate was all about. Christians and the Sabbath. I watched this, matter of fact, a few times, but it's interesting because here's what Steve Gregg said in this debate. Steve Gregg says, I don't believe, now this is Steve, what he's saying, I don't believe that God has ever changed His moral standards because God doesn't change. And moral standards are based upon God's character. I agree with that. Don't you agree with that? Sure. I agree with what Steve's saying right there. I believe that's right. He says, I define moral laws as those that are rooted in the character of God. I agree with that. You agree with that? Rooted in the character of God. So I have a question. Was the same moral laws as those that are rooted in the character of God in the very image that God created Adam and Eve? We're going to get into something really interesting based on what the critics say and argue against the Sabbath. Oh, the Sabbath didn't exist before Moses. By the way, we're going to be covering Nehemiah in 2 videos. Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 14. We're going to be covering that after I get through these parts on Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 14. 2 videos. So I'm going to ask this again. Was the same moral laws that those that are rooted in the character of God in the very image that God created Adam and Eve? The Bible tells us that Adam and Eve was created in God's image. Matter of fact, Genesis 1:26, and God said, let us make man in our image. So God created man in His own image, in the image of God. Created He him, male and female, created He them in His own image. So tell me, was that image righteous? Was that image sinless? Was that image perfect before the fall? And hath made of one blood all nations of men. Isn't that interesting that we all come from one blood? And our roots go right back to Adam and Eve in very creation. You see, sin violates the very image of God in man, yes or no? Sin is contrary to the image of God. Sin violates the very character and nature of the image of God in man. Yes? By the way, notice what Romans chapter 2, Paul says in Romans chapter 2 verse 14, notice what it says. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law. See, they stop. They don't want to stop, keep going. They want to stop right there, not the law. See where it says the Gentiles, which have not the law, they stop right there. See, there's a distinction between what that means. And we're going to look at that. But it's interesting. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. Now what's Paul talking about? Here's a question for the critics. The Gentiles do by nature the things contained in the law. So I ask the question, what things is contained in the law? They've never answered that question. The critics do not answer that question. What is contained in the law that they do by nature? Now remember, Dale Ratzlaff said what Israel was commanded to do, Adam and Eve did naturally. That's nature. Naturally. So my question is, what things is contained in the law? And where did the Gentiles get the idea to do by nature the things contained in the law? That Israel, the children of Israel, the Jews, was given in written, codified form. See, God wrote the 10 Commandments. The Jews had it in codified form, written. The Gentiles didn't have it written. But Paul tells us where it was written, not on stone. The critics tell us that the 10 Commandments was not given to the Gentiles, but for the Jews only, Israel, the children of Israel. Correct? That's what they tell us. This is what the critics say. The context makes it clear that Paul is referring to the Ten Commandments. Correct? You read Romans chapter 2. And Paul's talking specifically about the Ten Commandments. So let's plug their interpretation right into the text itself. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, Ten Commandments, because that's what they say, written on 2 tables of stone by the finger of God, do by nature the things contained in the law, the Ten Commandments, written on 2 tables of stone by the finger of God. These having not the law are a law unto themselves. Why is that? Because they do it naturally. They didn't have the Ten Commandments in written form on 2 tables of stone. They did it naturally. Which show the work of the law written where? In their hearts. Isn't that amazing? And so the critics want Paul to do away with the Ten Commandments, but then when they read this carefully, they see, wait a minute. Where did these Gentiles have the law written? On stone? No. In their hearts, their conscience. Also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. Why? Because the root of the sin problem is where? In the mind, in the heart. You don't have to commit sin in an outward, overt action. Because that sin, the root of that sin begins where? Your mind and your heart. Which show the work of the law, 10 commandments written on 2 tables of stone by the finger of God, where? Written in their hearts, their conscience, by nature. You see? Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest His will. So there must be something about the law of God that's His will. And Paul's talking in the context of the Ten Commandments. He mentions them. And knowest His will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. And art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of truth, what? In the law. Remember how the lawyer tried to trap Jesus. Well, which is the greatest commandment in the law? He was tempting Jesus. In other words, he had a bad motive. It wasn't the right motive. Thou therefore, which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal. Now, where's that commandment found? That's in the Ten Commandments. Dost thou steal? See, I believe Romans 2 is right at the core of legalism. In other words, legalism is right at the core of what Paul's saying. You're teaching another man not to do that while you're doing it yourself. You see? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery. Where's the commit adultery at? That's in the Ten Commandments. Yes or no? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery. Dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols. That's the second commandment. Dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God. So when a person's breaking the law, are they honoring God or dishonoring God? Paul makes it clear. There's no excuse for a Gentile to break God's law when God has put it naturally in their heart, just like He did with Adam. They don't have an excuse. So when you break the law, no matter whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, you are dishonoring God. Yes or no? For the name of God is blasphemed. That's the third commandment in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. Now, notice what he does. Now he switches to circumcision, because this shows whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised makes no difference. Sin is sin. And his sin is relevant to a non-Jew as much as it is a Jew. Either way. For circumcision barely profiteth if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. See, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. See, many of them thought, well, look, I'm connected to Abraham. Who are you to tell me about salvation? I'm connected to Abraham. I'm of the seed of Abraham. So Jesus, who are you to tell me this? You see what I'm saying? Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, there's your Gentiles that were uncircumcised, but they were doing by nature that which was contained in the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? So it's not external. It goes beyond external to the inner man that Paul speaks about. Where a person is a Jew inwardly, not outwardly, not external, but internal. And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision doest transgress the law? Paul's asking them questions. So I want to ask a question. Is Luke 10:26, Jesus said, what is written in the law? How readest thou? How do you read what is written in the law? Don't change what's written. Leave it like it is. You see, in Romans chapter 2, Paul was quoting from the Ten Commandments and said that the Gentiles who have not the written Ten Commandments law as the Jews had, but did do by nature the things contained in the law, the Ten Commandments. Would the moral laws rooted in the character of God, remember what Steve Gregg said? Would the moral laws rooted in the character of God have been in the very image of God that Adam was created in? Now listen to what Steve Gregg said. Justice, mercy, faithfulness, these are the character of God. And all laws that reflect that, like don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't dishonor your parents. He says these are all in the character of God. The character of God and all laws, I'm quoting him, reflects that like don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't dishonor your parents. When did that start? Wouldn't the character of God have always existed? When was the character of God first reflected in man that man don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't dishonor your parents? Would that have started when Adam was created in God's image? Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't dishonor your parents. Wouldn't that have been ingrained in his very character and image before the fall? Listen to what he says. Certainly many of the Ten Commandments embodied moral principles that existed before and after the law was given. Now think that through. Before and after the law was given. Steve Gregg believes that many of the Ten Commandments embodied moral principles that existed before and after the law was given. Just exactly how many of the Ten Commandments embodied moral principles, and be specific which ones of the Ten Commandments are moral principles. Or does Steve Gregg mean to say that the many of the Ten Commandments actually mean 9? What is the many? He only quoted a few of them there. Steve Gregg believes that many of the Ten Commandments embodied moral principles that existed before and after the law was given, but isn't any one of the Ten Commandments moral principles the very substance of the law? How can you separate moral principles from being the law itself? In other words, moral principles are moral law, correct? Is loving God and our neighbor moral commandments, moral law? Would all laws that reflect that, like don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't dishonor your parents, many of the 10 Commandments embodied moral principles that existed before and after the law was given, have been given to Adam and Eve. Listen to what he says. Those are moral laws because they are rooted in faithfulness and justice and mercy and the things that are a part of the character of God. So question, would those moral laws, the things that are a part of the character of God, have been given to Adam and Eve in creation? Isn't loving God and our neighbor a moral commandment and moral law? What about loving God and our neighbor? Would that too have been moral law for Adam and Eve? Notice what he says, but what is rooted in the character of God and is unchangeable is a moral law. Unchangeable. See, friends, God's character has never changed. It's always been. So was this unchangeable and moral law that was rooted in the character of God in the very image that Adam and Eve was created? Was it? In other words, was this unchangeable moral law that was rooted in the character of God given to Adam and Eve in the beginning in creation? I would have a hard time defending that it wasn't. You only have one of two choices. Either it was or it wasn't. So did this moral law of 9 commandments exist before and after Moses? According to the critics, it existed after Moses, even in the new covenant after the cross. Did this moral law of 9 commandments exist before Moses and is unchangeable and is moral law? Steve Gregg should give us from the Bible the exact list of moral commandments that is rooted in the character of God and is unchangeable. So we can know and see for ourselves the very moral law he is specifically speaking of. And don't you agree with that? In other words, show us, what are these moral laws you're talking about? Don't use the term moral laws in a general sense. Be specific. Give us Bible text to show us, what specific moral laws are you talking about? Because we hear Christians today say, oh no, we don't have to keep the Sabbath, but the other 9 commandments, they're restated in the New Testament, they're in the New Covenant. The other 9 commandments are moral. Okay? The other 9 commandments are reenacted, restated, they're repeated. That's what we hear all the time by the critics. That very thing. So what is rooted in the character of God and is unchangeable as a moral law, would that moral law have been created in the very character of Adam and Eve, created in God's image? Now notice what Steve Gregg goes on to say. Now Jesus came and he made a new covenant, and it's still important not to kill or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness. That's wrong. Now I'm recording what he says word for word. So you got 2 that's wrong there. That's what he said. Okay? I'm just recording what he's saying word for word. Now Jesus came and he made a new covenant, and it's still important not to kill or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness. That's wrong, no matter what time you live in. Wow, now that's interesting. No matter what time you live in, it's wrong to do those things, because that's rooted in the character of God. That's what he's saying. So at any time, that would be wrong to do. Jesus came, by the way, what you see highlighted is his statements. I'm beginning to highlight and italicize what they're saying. These are not my words. They're Steve Gregg's words here. Jesus came and He made a new covenant, and it's still important not to kill or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness. By the way, He's quoting from the second table of stone, isn't He? He's not quoting from the first table of stone. He's quoting from the second table of stone about loving your brothers yourself. That's what He's quoting from. Not to kill, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear false witness. That's wrong no matter what time you live in. Is that cherry picking the law when we hear all the time, if you're going to keep the Sabbath, then you should keep all of the law? Why wouldn't the same be true if you keep any one of the 10 commandments? The very same law that the Sabbath is in. Shouldn't you keep all of the law? Why cherry pick 9? See? So, is these 9 commandments the character of God? Eternal moral law for all mankind. They say it's in the new covenant. These 9. Character of God. Love God, love neighbor. So the character of God is 9 commandments, eternal moral law for all mankind. Because they tell us, yeah, the 9 commandments. By the way, we're going to see what critics say in this presentation tonight. Watch this. Question. Also, why do you not stone people to death for committing adultery and murder? You say that we are to keep these commandments. The critic tells us, yeah, we're to keep these. Steve Gray just did it. Don't commit adultery. We're to keep that commandment still. Yet I don't see people today taking their people out back and stoning them to death for breaking it. Do you? Remember what Steve Gregg said? Jesus came and He made a new covenant, and it's still important not to kill or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness. That's wrong no matter what time you live in. Would that also include the time of Adam and Eve? He said any time. Would these 9 commandments apply to Adam and Eve? Any time. Wouldn't these commandments, rooted in the character of God and as unchangeable as a moral law, also include the time of Adam and Eve? What do you think? Remember, He said Jesus came and He made a new covenant, and it's still important not to kill or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness. That's wrong no matter what time you live in. Now, there'll be somebody say, well, but how did Adam bear false witness? There wasn't nobody to bear false witness against. He did. And I can show you from the Bible he did. Another thing, not to kill. Well, when they sinned, what did they actually begin to do when they sinned? It's like a paradox. You're living and dying at the same time. We could say that about us. We are actually, right now, in the present tense, living and dying at the same time. Would these commandments have been given to Adam? What about Adam's parents? God was his creator. God was his father. You could read that in the genealogy in Luke chapter 3. All the way from Jesus back to Adam. Where so-and-so begot so-and-so, and so-and-so begot so-and-so. By the way, Adam was instructed that when he and Eve got married, Jesus quotes from the beginning. It wasn't divorce from the beginning. It was man and his wife from the very beginning. And he says in Genesis that the man's to leave his mother and father. In reference to Adam and Eve. You could read it in the book of Genesis, right there. So this must have applied. So would these commandments have been given to Adam and Eve long before Moses and Christians in the New Covenant? So there they are. There's the commandments they're quoted from. And of course, I have questions about that. How many of the 10 commandments would you say was given to Adam? There's 10 right there. Any of them? Some of them? 2 of them? 1? 3? How many would you say? If so, which ones? If none, Would you say that it was okay for Adam to have other gods? Don't say there wasn't other gods, because there was. New Testament tells us that the devil was the prince of this world. The devil is the god of this world. And you could look on the TV news each night now and see all that in action, can't you? Can you or not? Who's behind all that? What we see nightly on the news, who's behind all that? So if none, would you say that it was okay for Adam to have other gods, etc.? Each one of the 10 commandments, would it be okay for Adam to have made a graven image and bow down to it and worship it? Would that have been okay for Adam? Here they are. Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to have other gods? You go through and just answer yes or no, true or false. Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to make graven images and bow down to them? Acceptable to God. Would that have been okay? Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to take the name of the Lord thy God in vain? Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to not have rested on the 7th day that God blessed and sanctified? Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to dishonor God as his creator, his mother and father? God created them in his image, male and female. Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to murder? Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to commit adultery? What do you mean? How could Adam have committed adultery? By the way, adultery is unfaithfulness. And the law of God is spiritual. People are committing spiritual adultery all the time today and don't even realize it. By the way, Adam lived to be 930 years. So it wasn't just him and Eve from that point on, was it? Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to steal? That's what Eve did. She stole from the tree that belonged to God, and God said, don't mess with this tree. She stole from that tree. She stole something that didn't belong to her. Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to bear false witness against his neighbor? Now remember, Adam lived 930 years. Did they have any neighbors? In 930 years? Would it have been acceptable to God for Adam to covet? That's what they did with the fruit. They coveted that fruit. So our critics today tell us 9 of the 10 commandments are moral, but one of them is not moral. That's the Sabbath. You see, they only have this problem with one commandment. One commandment. So these 9 are moral principles. These 9 are moral commandments, repeated in the New Covenant. These 9 are moral principles and commandments for all mankind. Wouldn't that include Adam? Listen to this. Dale Ratziff says this on page 257 of his book. We must also understand that for society to function without anarchy, do we see anarchy in the news each night? Well, there's a lot of news that don't want to tell you the anarchy. They don't want to show you that. But do we see it? Listen to this. We must also understand that for society to function without anarchy, it must continue to have specific moral laws. Do tell us what they are, specific. To restrain the evil of the unregenerate heart. Today, modern society is reaping the results of the violation of God's moral law. God's eternal moral principles are not optional for a successful society. By the way, eternal. You see, God's character is eternal. It's not changed. Modern secular humanists who disregard God's moral principles will reap the inevitable results. Are we seeing that today? We are seeing within the United States and throughout the world a growing anarchy and human degeneration as a direct result of disobedience to God's moral laws. God's moral principles are not an option. They are eternal and apply to all mankind. So if they say 9 of those commandments, and which Dale does, is moral, and for all mankind, certainly that would have included Adam and Eve. So we've got 9 commandments that the critics are admitting without saying that existed with Adam and Eve, if it's for all mankind. Wouldn't that include Adam and Eve? If not, then explain it. Why not? Especially when they were created in God's image. His character. And Steve Drake said these are commandments that are rooted in His character. So we're going to begin to see at least the critics, whether they want to verbally say it out loud, they're admitting to their own words that these 9 commandments that were given to all mankind went all the way back to Adam and Eve. So we at least got 9 moral commandments with Adam and Eve. At least 9 of the 10. So just one that's not with Adam and Eve, just one. But the others are. And again, they won't want to say this out loud. They won't want to say this out loud. But when you start breaking down the very things they're saying, like this, God's moral principles are not an option. They are eternal and apply to all mankind. They didn't begin eternally with Moses. If they're rooted in the character of God, they didn't begin with Moses. They're created in the very image of God in His character. Adam was created in the very image of God's character. You see what I'm saying? So at least we know now, whether the critics want to admit it or not, at least we know that 9 of those commandments, with the exception of just one, was in the very image and rooted in the character of God and His nature, with Adam in the very beginning. All mankind are under the moral laws and principles of God. These laws are intrinsically true and operate whether or not they are known or unknown, accepted or rejected. Now that transcends all cultures. God is bigger than cultures. So whether this culture knows it or not, accepts it or rejects it, is actually secondary. Primary is God says it. You see? Whether they know it or not. Did any of the 10 commandments apply to Abraham? Now we talked about Adam. Now let's talk about Abraham a little bit. Did any, just one, any of the 10 commandments apply to Abraham? Did the moral laws, the character of God, the unchangeable moral law that existed before and after the law was given specific moral laws, God's moral law, God's eternal moral principles, God's moral principles are eternal and apply to all mankind. All mankind are under the moral laws. These laws are intrinsically true and operate whether or not they are known or unknown, accepted or rejected. I just quoted all their words. The critics. These words are the critics, not mine. Does all of this apply to Abraham? Now, after having said all that, I would have a hard time proving that it didn't apply to Abraham, based on the words of the critics themselves. Yes? Based on all that, I would have a hard time disproving that it wasn't applied to Abraham. Now listen carefully. Dale Ratziff says all the moral principles found in the 10 Commandments, in the 10 Commandment law of the Old Covenant, have been repeated in the New Covenant, with the exception of the Sabbath command. So what's that telling me? That's telling me that all these 9 that Dale Ratziff says are included except the Sabbath. That's only one out of it. Now, watch this. He says, where is it? In the New Covenant. Now, you remember what we read earlier in Dale Ratziff when he was talking about the Abrahamic covenant? The everlasting covenant? The New Covenant? In the New Covenant, Dale Ratziff says there's 9 commandments. So these 9 moral commandments, unchangeable moral law that existed before and after the law was given, specific moral laws, God's moral law, God's eternal moral principles, apply to all mankind. All mankind are under the moral laws. These laws are intrinsically true and operate whether or not they are known or unknown, accepted or rejected, applied to Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Enoch, Noah, all the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to Moses and us, correct? And yet people want to say, well, they didn't have this before Moses. But if it's eternal, and it's for all mankind, and it's based and rooted in the character of God, friends, you can't start with Moses. Don't tell me, critics, you have to start with Moses with all this. So they want to say 9 commandments are eternal moral law for all mankind. John Coleridge, he's a Jehovah's Witness, and he makes comments on our videos, sites. He makes comments, and I want to read one of his comments. He's a Jehovah's Witness, and listen to his comment. Here's what he says. John Coleridge says, the Bible clearly states, I'm quoting him word for word, the Bible clearly states that only the Sabbath day commandment has ended, because the Sabbath was only for the ones Moses brought out of Egypt. The new covenant reinstated the 9 other commandments. Now that's an interesting thought. And most of the critics will believe that. Most of the critics say that. Dale Ratzlaff repeated. Those who say reinstated. Those who say this very thing. And a lot of critics say this. So these critics are on the same page as John Coleridge, the Jehovah's Witness. And what I find interesting about this is all that we just read about being eternal, moral, commandments, all mankind. Then why would they need to be reinstated? They would have never been abolished. They're eternal. Don't say Jesus abolished them at the cross when they've always been eternal. Don't say that Jesus nailed these 9 commandments to the cross that are eternal and then they have to be reinstated. Bring them down off the cross and let's reinstate them. Something that is eternal and the character of God doesn't have to be reinstated of having been abolished and then reinstated. They're eternal. What value is it for Jesus to die on a cross to abolish the 10 commandments or abolish the 9 commandments and then turn right around, no Sabbath, but reinstate the other 9 when they're eternal? I can't figure that out. How can the critics say that? You can't have it on one side, eternal, based on the character of God, and then abolish them, that which is eternal. That makes absolutely no sense to me. So John, I'm asking John, the Jehovah's Witness, I'm asking John, was the 9 other commandments in the law that is good enough for Christians today, good enough for Adam and Eve then? And wasn't the other 9 commandments also given to those who Moses brought out of the land of Egypt? Or did he just give them the Sabbath, only 1 commandment of the 10 of those who were brought out of the land of Egypt? John Coleridge, the Jehovah's Witness, teaches the same thing Dale Ratzlaff does, or Tell Me Friend, or Rick Huntling, or Steve Gregg and company, etc. The critics, they have to say this to get rid of the Sabbath. And then the others are reinstated or reenacted or it makes no sense to me. Why is that if it's eternal? Wasn't the 9 other commandments given to the ones Moses brought out of Egypt too? Why do you believe that only the Sabbath was given to the ones Moses brought out of Egypt when the 9 other commandments was also given to the ones Moses brought out of Egypt too? And yet, they are somehow transposed to those who wasn't brought out of Egypt. How does that work? Because I wasn't brought out of Egypt, were you? Not of the literal land of Egypt. By the way, God uses in the book of Revelation Egypt in a symbolic term. He's not talking about literal Egypt in the book of Revelation. If the 9 other commandments were given to those after the cross who wasn't brought out of the land of Egypt, wouldn't the same 9 other commandments have been given to Adam and Eve and all the patriarchs before Moses? If they're eternal and they're rooted in the character of God, and Adam and Eve was created in the image of God. Dale Ratziff says the first day of the week in the new covenant. Now watch this. Remember, Dale Ratziff had tied the Abrahamic covenant. He tied the Abrahamic covenant to the everlasting covenant, to the new covenant. Dale Ratziff did that. We read his statements. First day of the week in the new covenant. Is Sunday, the first day of the week, moral laws, the character of God, unchangeable, the unchangeable moral law. Now we got Steve Gregg mixed in here. All these critics are saying all this. Okay? That existed before and after the law was given, specific moral laws, God's moral law, God's eternal moral principles. God's moral principles are eternal, apply to all mankind. All mankind are under the moral laws. These laws are intrinsically true and operative whether or not they are known or unknown, accepted or rejected. So we got Steve Gregg's statements in there, and we got Dale Ratziff's statements in there. We got the critics' statements in there. They want to say 9 of these 10 commandments are moral. But the Sabbath is ceremonial, they'll say. Ritual. Dale Ratziff says the Abrahamic covenant is also called the everlasting covenant. So the everlasting covenant is the Abrahamic covenant. Yes or no? Based on Dale Ratziff's statement. Let's read it again. The Abrahamic covenant is also called the everlasting covenant. So if I said to you, I believe we should keep the everlasting covenant. Am I talking about the Abrahamic covenant? That's what he's saying right there. But now, is the everlasting covenant the new covenant? I asked that question. The sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision. But you see today, friends, we don't get circumcised according to the Abrahamic covenant. But we're to be circumcised of the heart. Is that talking about literal circumcision? No. Not at all. Listen to what Genesis 26:5 says. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now this is interesting, you see, because this happened right here. He's talking about what happened prior to Abraham's death, because Abraham had died by the time this was written. It's interesting. You read the whole context. Before this verse and after this verse and all that, you'll see. Did the Abrahamic covenant that Dale Ratziff mentions have any of the 10 commandments? Remember, he said 9 of the 10 commandments are in the new covenant. But he calls that the old covenant, the 10 commandments. But 9 are in the new covenant. Of the 10 commandments, 9 are in the new covenant. So, if Abraham's covenant is the new covenant, and Abraham, the covenant was also for Abraham, would not have Abraham kept those 9 commandments as well? I'm not even talking about the Sabbath yet. I'm just talking about those 9 commandments. Let's just take the critics' statements and see if those 9 commandments exist before Moses. Because how can you have the new covenant without the 9 commandments that Dale Ratziff says is in the new covenant? And if the new covenant is the everlasting covenant, and that's Abrahamic covenant, then Abraham must have had at least 9 of the 10 commandments. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I see you're shaking your head, yes. In other words, what commandments in the 10 commandments were in the Abrahamic covenant? Remember what Dale Ratziff said, all the moral principles found in the 10 commandment law of the old covenant have been repeated in the new covenant with the exception of the Sabbath. So if you take away the Sabbath, which is 1 commandment, that means the rest is 9 commandments in the new covenant. Is that Do you see the same thing I'm seeing? In the law of Christ, we have moral and ethical principles above and beyond that of the Old Covenant law. Now that's interesting he would say that in the law of Christ. See, I believe the law of Christ is not contradictory to the law of God. Rather in harmony with. By the way, Jesus is God, and Jesus was at Mount Sinai too. Jesus was in creation too. So in the law of Christ, we have moral and ethical principles above and beyond that of the Old Covenant law. But he says 10 of those commandments were the Old Covenant, but yet 9 of those commandments are the New Covenant. That's confusing, isn't it? But 9 of those commandments. So are those 9 commandments at least still above and beyond that of the Old Covenant, which only had one more, was the 10, the 4th commandment? See, here's the way they see it. Moral. All of them are moral except for one. And they look at that one as ceremonial and ritual. So the Abrahamic covenant is the new covenant, which is also the everlasting covenant, which is 9 commandments. So did Abraham have these 9 moral eternal commandments that was in the Old Covenant that was repeated in the New Covenant? I'd have a hard time, based on what the critics is saying, to say, he couldn't have had. Well, if it's all the same covenant, then he must have had. How could you have 9 in the New Covenant, and the New Covenant is related to the everlasting covenant, and the everlasting covenant is related to the Abrahamic covenant, but no 9 commandments? That would make absolutely no sense, would it? Since Christ's blood ratified the Abrahamic covenant, that's what Dale Ratziff said. The Jesus' blood didn't ratify the Old Covenant with the 10 Commandments. He ratified the Abrahamic covenant, is what Dale Ratziff said. Since Christ's blood ratified the Abrahamic covenant and had nothing to do with what is contained in the Old Covenant, then how was 9 of the 10 Commandments in the Old Covenant repeated in the New Covenant? That began in the roots of the Abrahamic covenant. See the importance of that question? The covenant God made with Abraham is of great interest to our study, for here are the roots of what will be called the new or everlasting covenant. Did Abraham experience the new covenant, the everlasting covenant, that is given to Christians today? Well, we Christians are in the new covenant. And yet, the new covenant is related to the everlasting covenant, related to the Abrahamic covenant. And by the way, when we read the New Testament, we see that. We are of the seed of Abraham, being the seed of Jesus. You could read that in the New Testament. So what is the list of things that is in the new covenant? What is the list? What is it? Remember, at least we know 9 of the commandments have to be in the new covenant according to Dale Ratziff's statement. See, at this point, based on the critics' own words, we're just showing that whether they admit it or not, you have to show that the 9 commandments existed before Moses. Whether they want to admit that. All the moral principles found in the 10 Commandment law of the Old Covenant have been repeated in the New Covenant, with the exception of the Sabbath command. Now that's just a parrot. They've parroted this so much that you tell a lie so often and people believe it. That's exactly what's happened with this right here. John Coleridge said the same thing. They believe it. It's been parroted so much that they haven't challenged that thinking and have bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. So this causes confusion. You scratch your head and say, oh, okay, we don't have to keep the Sabbath, but the other 9 commandments in the same law we have to keep. I scratch my head and say, that's confusion. Confusion. Dale Ratziff says Old Covenant, 10 commandments, New Covenant. At least we know in the New Covenant, he says there are 9 of them. Dale Ratziff says day of worship, 7th-day history, 1st-day history. Now, of course, I don't find that in the Bible. But this is what he's saying. The first day of the week in the New Covenant. Well then, If the first day of the week is in the new covenant, wouldn't that make 10 commandments? How are we still on 9? If Sunday replaced the Sabbath in the new covenant by mentioning it's in the new covenant, and yet at the same time they say Jesus is our Sabbath. And yet at the same time they say it doesn't matter what day you keep as long as you keep one day in 7. And at the same time they say we should keep every day holy. That's confusion. So is the first day of the week in the new covenant moral law? For God said that in the new covenant that He would what? Write the law in our hearts. So was the first day of the week in the new covenant that Dale Ratzlaff mentions also in the Abrahamic covenant? Remember, he said that 9 of those commandments, and then he says the Sunday, first day of the week, is in the new covenant. But Abraham was before Moses. And so we can at least see 9 of those commandments. Remember, I'm just talking about 9 right now. In the next meeting and beyond that, we're going to be talking about why that one commandment's not. If we're showing from the critic's own words that at least 9 of those commandments existed before Moses. So what about this first day in the new covenant? The Dale Ratzlaff mentions also is the Abrahamic covenant. Did Abraham keep the first day of the week? Because Dale Ratzlaff says the first day is in the new covenant. And the new covenant is the everlasting covenant. The everlasting covenant is the Abrahamic covenant. So, if that's true, then Abraham must have kept the first day. But I don't think he did. Do you? Deuteronomy 5:2. So let's put their interpretation right into the text now. Remember, I got a whole video coming up on Deuteronomy chapter 5. But this is interesting. Let's plug their interpretation right into the text. All right? So let's do that. The Lord our God made a covenant, 10 commandments, with us in Horeb. The Lord made not this covenant, the 10 commandments, with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. Now that's what they're saying. 10 commandments was given only to Israel, but not the fathers. But yet, according to the Abrahamic covenant, the everlasting covenant, the new covenant, Dale Ratzlaff's got 9 commandments in the new covenant. That would mean at least Abraham kept 9 of the 10 commandments. He's the one that tied them all together, not me. I mean, he's the one that tied them all together. See that? Which the Bible talks about the everlasting covenant in the book of Psalms and also Chronicles. So I'm just saying he tied them together. That's what he did. And when we see that Israel was to keep the everlasting covenant, we find that in Psalms and Chronicles. Israel was to keep the everlasting covenant. Now let's look at verse 3 further with their interpretation. The Lord made not this covenant, the 10 commandments, with our fathers. With our fathers was the 9 commandments, moral and eternal, for all mankind from Adam in the beginning in creation. But with us only the 10 commandments, even us who are all of us here alive this day. Remember, Dale Ratzlaff has 9 of the 10 commandments in the new covenant. And the new covenant relates to the everlasting covenant. Relates that to the Abrahamic covenant. So at least, whether they want to admit that, they don't want to admit that, okay? But at least you've got to say, well, at least in the new covenant, there must be 9 that's related to Abraham, because you say it's the same. Do you follow my reasoning here? The Lord made not this covenant, the 4th commandment, the Sabbath, with our fathers. With our fathers was the 9 commandments, moral and eternal, for all mankind. But with us, only the Jews, Israel, the 4th commandment, the Sabbath. Even us, who are all of us here alive this day. Now that's what they're saying. And you know what? They're not going to want to admit this, but that's what they're saying. Because if Abraham had the everlasting covenant, And if Abraham had the new covenant, then of course there was at least 9 of those commandments that Del Ratz said is in the new covenant. So Abraham would at least have had 9 of the 10 commandments before Moses. Yes or no? With that reasoning. So here they are. So here's what it looks like. Here's what it really looks like. Because moral law is based and rooted in the character of God, and it's always existed. And if not to kill, and not to steal, and not to commit adultery is rooted in the character of God, that means it's always existed. It's always been. Would that at least 9 commandments that they consider to be moral and eternal have also applied to Adam? Based on the critic's own words, I wouldn't be able to defend why it wouldn't have been for Adam and Eve. So then you get to Moses, Old Covenant, 10 commandments for Jews only. 9 moral commandments for Jews only? They got a problem with that. You see, I believe the 10 commandments existed all the way from the very beginning there, in creation, being created in God's image. Now the New Testament Christians, New Covenant, 9 commandments, 9 moral commandments for all mankind. Did these 9 moral commandments exist previous to Moses? How is it that these 9 moral commandments exist previous to Moses, that the Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us? At least 9 of them had existed for the fathers, which is the covenant they said was not made with the fathers, based on Deuteronomy chapter 5. Is that confusion? The point is that by extension, if these 9 of the 10 commandments did exist previous to Moses, then that would include the Sabbath by extension in the same law written with the finger of God, correct? Did any one of these 9 moral commandments exist previous to Moses? Is any one of the 10 commandments eternal? Let's ask this question. Is there any of the 10 commandments that would have been for Adam? Is there any of the 10 commandments that would have been for Adam that is eternal for all mankind and is wrong no matter what time you live in? Remember what Steve Gregg said. But what is rooted in the character of God and is unchangeable and is a moral law. It's still important not to kill or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness. That's wrong no matter what time you live in. Now, it's interesting. He's quoting these passages of the second table of stone. I wished he would have quoted these passages in reference to the first table of stone. Because he's saying no matter what time you live. So would that no matter what time you live include the time of Adam and Eve? So we would still have no adultery, no stealing, no bearing false witness. Right there in the beginning with Adam and Eve. Like I said, they don't want to admit that at least 9 of the commandments that's moral and eternal existed with Adam. They don't want to. But based on their own words, let's define what's eternal and moral law rooted in the character of God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you so much for loving us. We thank you for the time we've spent together this evening. And we just ask that your Holy Spirit will continue to draw us closer to you. Teach us, Lord, your word and truth, we pray. In Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.